Hello and welcome to our lesson on solving quadratic equations by finding square roots, also sometimes called solving quadratic equations using the square root method or using square roots. So a couple different things that you'll need to keep in mind for this lesson are basics related to square roots. So beyond the brief review that I'll do within this lesson, I will also attach some extra video resources going back to the basics of square roots to make sure you have a foundational understanding there. So a couple different things to keep in mind. The first being that square roots use the radical symbol. So that symbol you see on calculators and things of that sort looks like this. Typically is referred to as the radical symbol. That's the mathematical term. A lot of people, though, just call it the square root sign, but it's technically the radical symbol. Then whatever is inside the radical symbol, so whatever value is inside, if we look at A here, 49 would be the example, that is referred to as the radicand. So just a couple of vocabulary terms there. We have the radical symbol, which is the symbol itself, and then whatever is inside is the radicand. Now, a couple things to, again, remember related to square roots. Square roots we can think of similar to the opposite function of squaring a number or taking it to the second power. So when you are trying to solve a square root, what you want to think is what number multiplied by itself will give us what is the radicand. So what number multiplied by itself is 49? Now, a lot of times people would obviously think 7 times 7 or 7 squared is 49, which is correct, but only half the answer. Because now that we are dealing with algebra concepts and out of middle school, you have to keep in mind, again, negative values. And again, any negative squared, or to the second power, equals a positive. So our answer to the square root of 49 would be positive 7 or negative 7, because a negative 7 times negative 7 is also a positive 49. Now in part B, the negative sign is outside of the radical. So if the negative's outside the radical, like we see here, that gets applied last. So we want to deal with the square root of 36 first. Square root of 36 would end up being a positive or negative 6. But because there's a negative sign out here, we don't look at the positive or negative. We just look at square root of 36 is 6, and it becomes a negative 6. So if there is a negative outside, that makes your final answer negative. In part C, if we have a negative in the radicand, your answer will always be undefined. No square roots, or no real square roots, I should say, can be a negative value. So if there is ever a negative inside of our square root or a radical, it is always undefined. Can't have the square root of a negative because a number times itself will never be a negative value. And then in D, a simple mathematical rule, the square root of 0 is always 0. 0 is neither positive nor negative, so we don't put a sign by it. Square root of 0 is just 0. In example 2, we are looking at this function right here, which is inside of our radical, we have b squared minus 4ac. And this is just a typical quadratic function. Quadratic up here, solving quadratic equations, which we'll get to in our next set of examples. But quadratic equations, quadratic functions, typically just refer to we have a variable or something to the second power. So if we have something going to the second power, you can think of that as a quadratic in this case. So in evaluating, that simply means to simplify or solve as far as possible. So we have b squared minus 4ac inside of the radical. So they gave us three values in part A. They want a to equal negative 7, b to equal 8, and c to equal negative 1. So we are going to take these three values and replace their variables or letters in the function. So it becomes the whole thing inside of our radical or square root, b being a positive 8, so we have a positive 8 squared, minus 4 multiplied by a, which is negative 7, multiplied by c, which is negative 1. So just like parentheses, we do the math inside the radical first. So 8 squared is 64. 4 times a negative 7 is a negative 28, times a negative 1 is a positive 28. So we'd have 64 minus 28. Then we have to do our subtraction. 64 minus 28 is 36. And the square root of 36 is a positive or negative 6. So this plus minus symbol here, plus above the minus, indicates that this value can be either positive or negative. So this is read as positive or negative 6. In B, A is 2, B is negative 3, C is negative 2. So I'm just going to, again, put those values in for their letters. So negative 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 2. Negative 3 squared is 9. 4 times 2 is 8, times negative 2 is a negative 16. So we have 9 minus negative 16, which is the same as 9 plus 16. So we have the square root of 25, which is a positive or negative 5. And then in part C, plugging these three values again in for their letters. So we'd have the square root of 9 squared minus 4 times 2. So that becomes the square root of 81 minus 32. 81 minus 32 is 49, and the square root of 49 is positive or negative 7. Example 3 simply says find all square roots of the number or write no square roots. So when they say find all square roots, they mean consider the positive or negative. So if it's a positive number, we will always have a plus minus for all the square roots. Square root of 81 is a positive or negative 9. In B, if it's a negative value, there's always no square roots. And in C, this is where you could use your calculator and the square root function. So you would do the square root of 1.21, which would give you 1.1. And because we're answering for all square roots, it's a positive number, so we would need the plus minus. And then example 4 is where we start to solve our equations themselves. So simply put, if you ever have a variable squared equaling a number, so in A here, we have x squared equals 144. How we solve that, we need to solve for x. So to undo the x squared, we would square root both sides. So if you're ever undoing a square in solving equations, so ever undoing anything to the second power, use square root both sides. So then our answer would become square root of x squared is x. Square root of 144 is plus or minus 12. In part B, x squared equals 6. So we would square root both sides. So x would be the positive or negative of the square root of 6. Now, square root of 6 is not a perfect square, meaning we're going to get a decimal. So I'd put that into your calculator. Square root of 6 is approximately 2.45. So our answer is approximately positive or negative 2.45. And in C, x squared equals negative 7. So if we try to square root both sides, the negative 7 is inside the square root, meaning we have no real solutions because there's a negative inside the square root. Then our last few examples are our multi-step equations. So the way we need to solve these, we're going to work the order of operations backward. So again, we want to get x alone, but we have to isolate it first, meaning to undo the math that's already there. So currently we have 5x squared minus 20 equals 0. So we're working order of operations backward. So we have to undo the subtraction of 20 by adding 20 to each side. So our problem or equation now becomes 5x squared equals 20. Now we have 5 multiplied by x squared, so we have to undo multiplication. So we divide each side by 5, and we get x squared equals 4. Then our last step is to square root each side to get rid of the x squared. So x would equal the square root of 4, which is a positive or negative 2. So your final answer, x equals positive or negative 2. In E, we have 3x squared minus 75 equals 0. So add 75 to each side. 3x squared equals 75. Undo multiplication. Divide each side by 3. X squared equals 25. And then square root each side. X equals positive or negative 5. In F, 2 times x squared minus 22 equals 50. Now, I'm not worried about 50 on the opposite side because that's where we want it. We want to get x alone. So we will add 22 to each side. 2x squared equals 72. Then we have to get rid of the 2 by dividing. X squared equals 36. And the square root of 36 is a positive or negative 6. And then our last two examples. So in G, we have 4x squared plus 44 equals 0. So we would subtract our 44. 4x squared equals negative 44. Divide both sides by 4, and we'd have x squared equals negative 11. So when we square root each side, x would equal the square root of negative 11, which again we cannot do. So our answer would be no real solution. And in H, we have negative 2x squared plus 20 equals 0. So I have to undo my addition, subtract 20 from each side. Negative 2x squared equals negative 20. So we'll divide each side by the negative 2. And x squared equals 10. So we would square root each side. X would equal a positive or negative square root of 10, which is approximately a positive or negative 3.16. So again, I encourage you to, first off, make sure you have a solid foundation of square roots. So I'll include a couple extra videos if you need a refresher there. And then again, as you are going through your practice problems, be very careful of your positives and negatives and make sure you work the order of operations in reverse to solve these multi-step or two-step equations.